Please give relief and release for my girl. This is a summary of a desperate plea of a distraught mother who came to see Jesus while he was visiting in the region of Tyre and Sidon. We read Mark's version of the woman's desperation in verse 26 of the 7th chapter of Mark's Gospel. He says, the woman was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. A demon possession is, in our Lord's day, a very serious condition. In Mark chapter 9, verse 17, we have a description of what the woman must have experienced with a daughter that was being terrorized and occupied and controlled by a demon. In that case, in Mark chapter 9, Jesus was returning from Mount Transfiguration, and as he was coming down the mountain, he saw a crowd gathered at the base. There, a father came up to him, telling him what the issue was. His disciples were struggling to expel a demon that has taken over the body of his son. And so we read in Mark chapter 9, verse 17, Teacher, I brought you my son because he had a spirit that makes him unable to speak. And whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes stiff. One presumes that the child passes out after one of these episodes. And so what is described here in Mark chapter 9, verse 17, is most likely what is happening to the woman's daughter, the mother's daughter, who was being tormented and terrorized by a demonic spirit. It is described as an unclean spirit. Jesus and his disciples has crossed the physical border that separated the region of Israel from Tyre and Sidon. The crossing of the border marked a significant shift in his ministry. Up to that point, Jesus focused his ministry almost exclusively on the Jews living in Israel. The Jews benefited from his ministry. After this encounter with the anxious mother, he would go on to include non-Jewish people as recipients of his ministry. And so we read in the text in Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 30. From there, he went on to the region of Tyre and Sidon. He entered a house and wanted no one to know it, but he could not be hidden. For a woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Verse 27, But Jesus said to her, Let the children be filled first. The other translation would say, Let the children be satisfied first. For it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. And she answered and said to him, Yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs under the table ate from the children's crumbs. Then he said to her, For this saying, go your way. Another translation would say, Because of this word, go. The demon has gone out of your daughter. And when she came to her house, she found the demon gone out and a daughter lying on the bed. The response of Jesus to this woman's urgent request is strange, even bizarre. This woman heard that Jesus was in the area. It was a rare visit. And she made use of the opportunity to approach him so that he can provide release and relief to a daughter. The situation was desperate. The daughter was being terrorized and being tormented by an unclean spirit, and she desperately needed the intervention that Jesus alone can provide. In Mark chapter 3 verse 8, there is some evidence that people from this region benefited from his ministry. And that must have gotten around by word of mouth. And so when she heard that Jesus was in the area, she made it a point to go knocking on the door of the house where he was staying and to plead with him to urgently intervene in a domestic situation where a demonic spirit has taken over the life of her own daughter. And she was terrified, petrified, and she needed Jesus to intervene. And his response was unusual, even bizarre. And his response to the woman's appeal comes in the form of a riddle or parabolic saying. And this parabolic saying is a carefully crafted allegory explaining to the woman why he will not heal her daughter. And so what Jesus is responding to this woman is with a negative: no, do not expect help at this time. And so we read his response: let the children be satisfied first, for it is not right to take the bread of children and throw it to the dogs. That is a bizarre, strange way to respond to something that he can provide release and relief for. And we will read and we will see as we go on into the study that it was a carefully crafted test for this woman to test her faith. And so Jesus' response to this urgent interruption was, do not expect help at this time. And so the scene that he's envisioning is a time of eating in a peasant's house. The children are seated waiting to be fed, and nearby are the dogs. These dogs are waiting to get scraps from the food. Now, in Israeli culture at that time, dogs were not pets. In ancient culture, ancient Israel culture, these dogs ran around in packs, scavenging for food. The Jewish community considered these dogs as scavengers because they saw them as unclean, and also these dogs came into contact with food that was unclean, often discarded dead animals. And so because these dogs came into contact with unclean elements, they then would be considered as unclean. So it's an insult to refer to someone as a dog. And these dogs that Jesus is referring to are unclean because they ate unclean things. So what is Jesus saying here? Why is he responding in such a negative fashion? To decipher the meaning of the parable, one has to look at the context from which he is coming from. The context here, in Old Testament context, the children was often the unbelieving Israel. The Bible speaks about Israel being the children of God. And so Jesus is saying, in this context here, the children is referring to unbelieving Israel, stands for unbelieving Israel. The bread stands for his ministry. And Jesus is saying, the children that is unbelieving Israel must first be fed, must have first benefit from Jesus' ministry. And that is true. Jesus was born in a Jewish family. His mother and father were Jewish. And if you look into the Gospels, particularly the Gospel according to Matthew, the genealogy of Jesus can be traced right to Abraham. And so we have a Jewish man who was born into a Jewish family, and the main purpose was that the Jews might benefit from the ministry. What Jesus is saying here is that the Jews had first claim to his ministry. And by implication is that this claim is not done at the expense of the Gentiles. And so so Jesus is saying, through this parabolic saying, that the special privileges, his ministry, the bread of the Jews, must not be thrown to the Gentiles, because the Jews have not yet been satisfied. And so there is a delay as to when the Gentiles would experience the benefits of his ministry. And based on the timeline of God, the Jews have first priority of the ministry of Jesus, first priority to the ministry of Jesus, because the age of the Gentiles, the worldwide proclamation, has not yet come. And so he is saying to her, since the Jews have not fully benefited from his ministry, they are not satisfied. He cannot take that what was meant for the Jews and give it to the dogs, because it doesn't fit into the timeline of God. That was his test to her. She interprets it not as a rejection, but rather as an invitation. She thinks to herself, the Gentiles, she and her daughter, was always included to benefit from God's mercy. And this gives her hope, because Jesus says the children must be satisfied first. The Jews must first benefit from his ministry, then the Gentiles. And so her interpretation is, wait, there is hope that the Gentiles was destined by God to enjoy and to benefit from the ministry of Christ, but according to God's timeline. And so Jesus is basically telling her, she is begging for food like a scavenger dog would beg. She's asking for something that does not properly belong to her. She's asking for something that does not belong to her as a scavenging dog. He's testing her faith by telling her, no, I will not provide help to your daughter, because the time of the Gentiles has not yet arrived. We have to wait until the Jews, the children, to be satisfied first, and then we will include the Gentiles, the dogs. And so she is being depicted as interrupting God's plan, because she's wanting the benefits of the ministry of Jesus right now, but it's ahead of God's program. So Jesus responds with this saying, it is not, let the children be satisfied first. And since Israel is not yet satisfied, it's not right to me, not right for me to take the ministry, my ministry, and give it to the Gentiles. So according to this parabolic saying, there is a Jewish priority in God's program, and unless the Jews are fed first and they are satisfied, then the Gentiles will get their chance. The woman listens to that, and in spite of the insult that is intended, that she is a scavenger dog trying to claim something that she is not entitled to, she draws not offense, but hope. And in her response, she shows that she understood the riddle, and then she extends the riddle to include her daughter. She shows that she understands the parabolic saying, but then she responds with an extension of the same parable to include her own daughter and herself. She responds in verse 28. Yes, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And so what she does is she doesn't oppose Jesus. She doesn't complain about God's program by putting the Jews first, but rather she extends this allegory to show to Jesus that her daughter also have a place in the program of God. And so she is displaying tremendous insight into God's program, but she also displaying immense intelligence. She is displaying the elements that the disciples are not displaying yet. She understands the program of God, that the Jews will first benefit from his ministry, but there is also place for the Gentiles. And so when she says, "Yes, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs," she is saying she and her daughter is also included in order to benefit from the ministry of Jesus. But in this case, all she's asking for is crumbs. So what was the basis of the woman's response? In other words, what we have here is a woman who refuses to take no for an answer. Jesus says no, not at this time. She says yes, there is place for us. And so based on her response, she is displaying that she refuses to take no as an answer. But what is the basis for that refusal? The first basis of that refusal is the person of Christ. She sees and hears the word first. And that word first, Jesus says, we must wait until the children are fed first. That word first gives her a sense of hope. She interprets that first as a basis to reject Jesus' response of no, but rather to try to convince him that she can benefit from his ministry. And so Jesus says the children must be satisfied first, and by implication there's also a second. And so she sees the breadth of God's grace that includes not only the Jews but also the Gentiles in God's salvation plan. And this word first engenders hope in her thinking. She sees and she knows that God has established a timeline for his salvation plan. And in God's timeline for salvation plan, the Jews was meant to get priority. Now this is in keeping with the scriptures. Jesus is saying to the woman and then to us is that in God's timeline, the Jews, Israel, would get priority in terms of having the first bite at his ministry. In keeping with the Old Testament, God worked almost exclusively with the Jews. He appeared to Abram, and from Abram he built a nation where God would use the nation of Israel as an example on what a nation looks like when it's under the control and under the rule of God. Unfortunately, Israel was unfaithful, but it didn't change the plan of God. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, would reflect this priority by stating in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of Christ unto salvation." And then he gives God's timeline, first to the Jew and then the Gentile. In other words, that Jesus is saying that God's plan of salvation was destined to come to the Jew first, but it's not exclusively to the Jews. That God's plan was always intended to share the bread or salvation with the Gentiles. And so the woman listens to Jesus. She responds with her own parable in order to extend his saying to include her daughter. And she says, "Yes, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And what she's saying is that we do not have to wait for the Gentiles, for the Jews to be fully fed, because the Gentiles can also benefit from the ministry at the same time. And so the words that Jesus says to her doesn't discourage her, but in the opposite, it encourages her. And so she listens to Jesus, and on the basis of his word, she gives him a reply. Jesus says in his original saying to the woman, "It's not good." The woman responds and says, "Yes, Lord." And in that response, she is acknowledging his authority and dependence on him. And so the foundation of her confidence is the character of Christ. Granted that the children of Israel has priority, but the dogs, the Gentiles, also have a legitimate share of the ministry of Jesus. She insists that the dogs, the Gentiles, must have their day, but the Gentiles can be fed at the same time as the Jews. The Gentiles don't have to wait. The woman's point is this: she doesn't want to diminish Israel's privileges, but all she wants is a leftover crumbs. From her perspective, the leftovers from the ministry of Jesus to the Israelites is enough to provide release and relief for a daughter. The Gentiles are not the first to eat, but they're not excluded from eating from the scraps that falls under the table. And so what she does here is that she doesn't question God's plan of election. She doesn't complain to God or to Christ that God's plan is wrong because he chose the Jews first. What she does is that she takes the words of Jesus, and through her response, she is displaying tremendous insight into the plan of God. And she's saying, I don't disagree that the Jews have priority, but at the same time, I believe that we can benefit from the leftovers of the ministry that you were giving to the Jews. This woman is displaying tremendous confidence in the power of Christ. She says, I'm not asking for the full menu. All I'm asking is for the leftovers of your ministry, because the leftovers of your ministry is sufficient to provide release and relief for my daughter. And this woman's intelligent response shows that she has faith in Jesus, but she also understands God's mission through Jesus Christ. She is demonstrating greater insight into God's kingdom than Israel's religious leaders and the disciples himself. And then we have the great reversal. Jesus' response, go, the demon has left. Now we have the great reversal where the person who is called a dog is blessed by receiving the benefits that were reserved for the children. Because of the faith and confidence that she displays in Christ, because of a great insight into the plan of God, into God's mission through Jesus Christ, she had the confidence not to accept no as an answer, because on the basis of a rejection of Jesus' no is his character. She calls him Lord. She understands that in God's program there is a priority, but that priority to the Jews was never at the expense of the Gentiles. Jesus' ministry to the Jews was that they would benefit from his ministry, and they did. But at the same time, the Gentiles also benefit from his ministry. As I said in earlier studies, that this story is included, or this episode is included in Mark's Gospel to teach his disciples that Jesus is the only one that can break down barriers. I said in previous study, he broke down a variety of barriers. Not only did he cross over the geographical barrier that separated Tyre and Sidon from Israel, he also broke down a number of other barriers. And in this context, The woman's confidence in Jesus shows that she had enough faith in his ability to break down barriers. And there are two barriers in this context here. The first one was the barrier of distance. Is the barrier of distance. The woman did not deem it necessary, or this mother did not deem it necessary for her daughter to be present when she approached Jesus. She believes, she had confidence in Jesus who is able to break the barriers set up by distance. Even though the child was in another section of the city, she believed that Jesus' power is enough to transgress or to climb over that barrier of distance, because he can provide release and relief to her daughter without the daughter being present. That's one barrier. The other barrier that is clear in this text is a barrier of rejection. Jesus tests this mother's faith by using a parabolic saying of rejection. She refuses to give up, recrafting a metaphor of rejection into a metaphor of acceptance. There's a few things unique about this lady. She's the only person in God's gospel, she's the only person in Mark's gospel to call Jesus Lord. And she's the only person who understands a parable without the interpretation of Jesus. In Mark chapter 4, Jesus would teach the parable of the sower. And at the end of this long parable, the disciples came to him, asking him to explain the parable to them. Here, in this context, this outsider, this pagan, unclean woman, understands the parable that Jesus is speaking to her about without his interpretation. This shows a woman who had tremendous spiritual insight into the words of Christ or into the plan of God. She calls him Lord. She acknowledges that he is Lord over her, and also she understands a parable without the interpretation of Jesus. She rebukes the disciples because of the lack of insight. Here she has insight into the plan of God, but also she has insight into the parabolic saying of Christ without him having to explain it to her. The second thing that happens here when it comes to the barrier of rejection is this woman understands that the power of God is active in the person of Christ and is able, as I said earlier, even to decipher a very difficult parable. And on the surface, it appears that Jesus is denying healing to her daughter. But she has enough confidence in the person of Christ and into the program of God to know that the Gentiles also have a place in God's program. And so even though he initially says no, she refuses to take no for an answer because she knows that Jesus is able to break down the barrier of distance, is able to break down the barrier of rejection because she has insight into the program of God. And Jesus then acknowledges this woman's tremendous insight, not only in his character, but also into the program of God. And he says in verse 29, because of this word, go. He acknowledges that this woman has insight into the program of God. He acknowledges that this woman has insight into the person of Christ. And therefore she placed her confidence in the one who's able to break down the ultimate barrier. And that is the barrier of rejection, and as well as the barrier of distance. And so this mother refuses to take no for an answer, or she refuses to take no as an answer because she understands the program of God. That when the ultimate barriers of distance and rejection are dismantled by Christ, there is a great reversal. And in this case, the person who is called a dog is blessed by receiving the benefits that were reserved for the children. The person whom is called a dog is blessed by receiving the benefits that were reserved for the children. Her confidence in Christ convinced her that he is able to break down the ultimate barrier of distance and rejection. And because of that confidence in Christ, there occurs a great reversal. The one who was considered a dog is blessed by receiving the benefits that were reserved for the children. So what does this lesson teach us? What does the lesson teach me? Because this woman believed that Jesus' ministry, the leftovers of Jesus' ministries are enough to free her daughter from demonic control. I must keep trusting Christ to remove those obstacles that hinder my ability to gain from His ministry. Let me say that again. Because this woman believed that Jesus' ministry leftovers are enough to free her daughter from demonic control, I must keep trusting Christ to remove those obstacles that hinder my ability to gain from His ministry. So when I pray and say, Lord, I want you to intervene in a specific person's life, like my children, I have enough confidence in Him to break down those barriers that those children has erected in order to isolate and insulate themselves from His ministry. But I trust Him because He's able to break down that barriers. If I want God to intervene in the lives of other people, and there were obvious barriers that seems to exclude Him, but I need to know that Jesus' leftover ministry is enough to free that person from the clutches of sin, because He is the one who breaks down and dismantle barriers that insulate and isolate me from His blessing. The lesson of this whole episode is, because this mother believed that the ministry of Jesus' ministry leftovers are enough to free her daughter from demonic control, we must keep trusting Christ to remove those obstacles that hinder us from gaining from His ministry. Whether it's ignorance, whether it's a lack of faith, whether it is a lack of trust, I need to pray, Lord, help me in my unbelief, because You alone are able to remove those barriers. And all I'm asking is not the full menu, but only the leftover of Your ministry, because even that is sufficient to free me as He freed the daughter from demonic control. I must keep trusting Him, because He is the only one that can dismantle barriers that insulate and isolate people from His message.